Well, years and years ago, now I moved to Dallas to go to Dallas Theological Seminary, which is a graduate school to prepare for pastoral ministry. And as I moved there, I moved there and I was there. The first 4 months I was there, I received 3 speeding tickets. I became very familiar with how the speeding ticket rules work. The first one, I did defensive driving. Watched the videos. We've all probably done it. Watched the videos, and I got it expunged from my record. Great. The second ticket, they have a little thing called deferred adjudication, which means if you don't get a ticket for 6 months, then they will take that off your record, but you have to pay for it. But the problem was, I got a third ticket in a matter of 4 months. And so here I am, I've done defensive driving, I was in probation, and so I go to the judge, and I'm basically groveling at this point. I go to the judge, and the judge is there, and he opens up his little book, and he says, young man, which is a bad way for this thing to start. He says, young man, what were you doing at 11:45 p.m. on a Wednesday night? And I said, well, sir, I'm in seminary, and I don't have a printer, and so I was going to print, you used to have to print papers, to print a paper so I could turn in the next day. And I was like, kind of hoping for the best here, embracing for the worst. And he says, oh, you're in seminary, huh? So you're studying to be a pastor? I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, I am. He said, okay. He said, well, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you deferred adjudication, which means don't get a ticket for the next 6 months, and this ticket will not go on your record. I said, thank you so much. I'll pay whatever it takes. I'm a poor seminary student, but I'll pay whatever it takes just to get this off my record. And he said, well, come to think of it, you're probably a poor grad student, aren't you? I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm a very poor grad student. I have no money. So he takes the number that I was supposed to pay, and he takes it in half. I'm like, oh, thank you so much. And he goes, well, actually, come to think of it, my pastor doesn't make very much money. You're probably never going to make very much money, are you? And I said, no, sir, I'm never going to make very much money, ever. And he takes it, and he halves it again. At that point, I jumped across the bench and gave him, no, I didn't, but I wanted to jump across the bench and give him a hug and just say, thank you so much. I came expecting the worst, that my insurance bill would spike up and I would have this ticket on my record for 5 years, 3 tickets in 4 months, and instead, I received mercy and grace. Now, these words, mercy and grace, we know these words, but I think in reality, we have barely scratched the surface of what these words mean. I mean, I've been talking and preaching about grace for 24 years, and I feel like I'm still learning. It's still peeling back the onion of what is grace. Now, we know mercy. Mercy, the technical definition is actually not getting what you deserve. I deserved this, to pay this ticket. I deserved to have this on my record for 5 years, and he showed me mercy. It's not getting what you deserve. And grace is actually getting what you don't deserve. I did not deserve deferred adjudication. I did not deserve to have this thing cut in half twice, but he gave me that grace. And mercy and grace, it's so essential that we understand it, because as I prayed here just a few moments ago, I believe it is actually the lens by which we live our life as we follow Jesus. And what we've been saying over these last few weeks is that as we deliberately follow Jesus, there's these transformations that God does in us. And he's the one who does them. And whether we've been walking with Jesus for 50 years or 50 days, there's still growth to be done in all of these areas. And there's these 5 transformations that we've been talking about, and I have a slide here. These are the 5 that we've been working through. The first one is from death to life. That not only as we follow Jesus, as we believe in Jesus, we transfer from eternal death to eternal life, but also we go away from the stuff of death, the stuff that will destroy us, into the abundant life. This is the process of following Jesus. And that we move, as we talked about last week, from a life under the influence of the flesh, which is the old way, into a life that is under the influence of the Holy Spirit that is in us, that directs us and guides us and leads us forward. And then today, we're going to talk about this third transformation. From a life motivated and shaped and formed by shame, to a life that is motivated and shaped and formed by God's unbelievable grace. And so to talk about that today, we're going to need to understand a little bit about these 2 words, shame and grace. And we're going to start with this understanding of shame. And shame is this unique word. It's different than guilt. Guilt is, I did something wrong. I did something wrong. I made a mistake. And shame is, I am wrong. I am a mistake. There's a subtle difference here. Guilt says, I did something wrong, and yet shame says, I am wrong. And shame always speaks to our identity. It gets inside of us and it says, this is who I am. So let's say you cheat on a test. You violated your values and you cheated on a test. And you go, you know what? I made a mistake. That's guilt. That's conviction. I made a mistake. I need to make it right. But shame says, I'm flawed. I'm a cheat. I'm a liar and I will be forever. That's what shame does. Now, one author who's not necessarily a Christian author, but an author named Brené Brown, she writes a lot on shame. She's kind of the expert on shame. I don't know why anyone would want to be an expert on shame, but that's what her life has been. And she defines it like this. She says, shame is believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. Now, Peter Scazzero, who writes kind of definitely from a Christian perspective, he defines it like this, and I have this on the screen as well. Shame is the intensely painful feeling of being flawed, defective, and unworthy of connection with God, with others, and with yourself. This is shame. Notice these words. They're significant. Flawed, defective, unworthy. That's how you know it's shame, because it speaks to who you are. And it becomes the lens by which we see the world. That we are unworthy and flawed and defective. And so today I want to look at two typical responses to shame. And then we're going to look at God's grace in light of that. So the two typical responses to shame are, one, we accept it as truth. We accept it as our identity. We just go, this is who I am. I am that person. I cheated, so therefore I am a cheat and will be a cheat forever. That's one response. The other response is to try and overcome it or try to cover it, to do everything we can to make sure we do not feel those feelings of unworth and shame. And so to look at that, we're going to look at this very famous story, one of my favorite stories in the scriptures that Jesus tells, and it's the story that is typically known as the prodigal son. If you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to Luke chapter 15. There's Bibles in the front of you there, and then we'll have it on the screen as well here. But in Luke 15, Jesus tells this powerful, powerful story. Last night, as we were talking this through, we said, we could spend probably a whole year on this one story, but we'll look at it today. Luke 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus, he also said, a man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. And so he, the father, distributed the assets to them. Now, here's what happens. The younger son, he comes to his father, and by law, with 2 boys, the older son would get about 2/3 of the wealth from this father. The younger son would get 1/3. And obviously, this comes as an inheritance when he passes away. That's how these things work. And so he comes to him, he says, I want you to give it to me now. I'm young, you're still alive. I don't want to wait till you die to just live it up. I want this wealth that is coming to me, and I want it now. And he says, give to me that which is your estate. And that word estate is actually the word life. So in some ways, what he's saying is, give to me what is actually worth your life to me, your wealth. Now, this is a slap in the face in our culture right now. But in this culture, in a shame-based culture, this is an absolute slap in the face. This is betrayal. To come to your father and say, you're basically dead to me. What I really want is what you can give me when you die. That's what he says. And all the scholars of the time say what a father should do at that point is to say, no, right? And punish him for even asking the question. But this father says, okay, we'll gather everything together, and I'll give you 1/3 of my wealth. And he'll bear the shame of all the whispers in the community, in the village that would say, can you believe what that father did? Can you believe what that son did? He asked for 1/3, and the father actually gave it to him. And the father would bear the shame of that. Verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had, and he traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. So the prodigal, he goes out, and he's living it up. I'm kind of picturing him sort of buying rounds for everybody and just living it, living large. And it says he's squandering the wealth, literally scattering the wealth, just scattering it out. And it's all gone. A third of his father's wealth, which we can only imagine was quite significant. A third of that wealth is now all gone, and then a famine hits. And unbelievably, all those people he was buying rounds for are no longer there. Nobody gave him anything, it says. And so what does he do? He says, I'm going to get a job working with the pigs. In this time, again, culturally, pigs are ceremonially unclean to the Jewish audience. So when they hear this, this is the dirtiest of dirty work you could possibly do. This is shameful work. And the son, after this failure, after this disappointment, after losing everything, is now looking at the food the pigs are eating and going, man, I could go for that because I'm hungry and I have nothing. When he came to his senses, verse 17, he said, how many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food? And here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up, go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers. Now, he comes to his senses. He says, oh, look, my father has all these servants. They get paid. They actually eat. They have food. They're not wishing for the food from the pigsty. And he says, I'll just go back and I'll have this conversation with him. Now, if you think about it, well, what took him so long? He knows his father. He can always go home. But when he left, it was this cutting of ties. It was this, I'm no longer going home anymore. I've left my family. You're as good as dead to me. And I'm leaving to go live my own way. He knew that if he walks back into that village, the gates is where everyone hung out, and at the gates they would have been like, oh, here he comes. Look at him now, the big shot, coming in these rags. He's lost a lot of weight. He sure does look bad. He didn't really live it up, did he? He knew he would receive the snickers and the jeering of the people at the gate. And then he knew also he has an older brother, we know, and his older brother, as we're going to learn later, would be like, I can't believe you did this, and you actually showed your face here. And then he'd have to face his father, the one he betrayed, the one he said, I just want your money. That's all you're worth to me. But he hits rock bottom. He says, I got to go back. And he says this speech. I love this because it's so human, isn't it? He's like, I know what I'll say. And you can almost hear him like practicing this little speech along the way, all the way back. The first thing he says, his speech, 1, I have sinned against heaven and you. True. 2, I'm not worthy to be called your son. Notice something there. Remember we talked about guilt and shame? Guilt, it's true. I have sinned against heaven and you. Shame is, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. That's what he says in his speech. And then he says, but I've come up with my own solution. My solution is, I'll be one of your hired servants. And then every single day, I will wake up and I'll remember what I did and who I am. That I'm a failure. That I'm a disgrace. And I'll wake up and go, you know what? There's my family's house, but I'm in the servants' quarters. And I'm working every day, remembering who I am and who I'm not. That was his solution. You see, this is that typical first response when it comes to shame. We accept it as our identity. Say, you know what? I'm no longer worth anything. I'm flawed, I'm defective, I'm unworthy, I'm not even called to be a son. I will live my days over here. When we accept it as this truth and as our identity, it becomes, as I said earlier, the lens by which we see the world. is this is what we do. This is who I am. And maybe you were called the black sheep. Maybe you were called the slacker in your family. Or maybe you didn't match up to somebody, a sibling or a parent, and you go, I'll never match up. And this kind of became the language. And what happens is we go, all of a sudden, I'm the black sheep. Like, not only do I do things that a black sheep does, I am a black sheep. So then what does a black sheep do? We keep doing things that black sheep do. And it's a cycle. And we think there's something in us that goes, if I'll just accept it as my identity and just claim it, it will heal the shame in me. But it does not work. Because what does it do? It actually just leads to more shame, and it's this cruel cycle. Because accepting shame as our identity is not the way to be healed from shame. For the prodigal, it was his failure. For us, it could be that as well. Could be that something in our life, we look back and we go, there's a failure there, there's something, and again, we kind of go, part of being human is making mistakes. But when shame takes over is when all of a sudden it goes, I am a mistake. When we are known and identified and defined by our mistakes, that's when shame takes over. It could be shame about something about our appearance. It could be shame about parenting. There's a lot of shame that goes around this idea of parenting and what we did or what we didn't do or what we should have done for our kids. And there's a lot of posturing when it comes to parenting because of that. It could be shame around our family of origin, something either that happened in our family or something that maybe one of those secrets nobody talks about in our family. Could be that if you had a parent leave or abandon you for really any reason, shame is that voice that says, you weren't worth staying for. That's not true, but that's the voice of shame. This is when my dear friend in her 90s would say, you've gone from preaching to meddling. But this is what's deep in here, isn't it? Could be shame around money. I've known people who've had shame for not having money. I've known people who've had shame for having money, which tells you it's really not about circumstances. It's about what's inside. Could be shame around work, something about work, either the work you did or something that happened at work. Could be shame around mental or physical health that so many of us struggle with, and yet there's this tendency to have shame around that. There could be religious shame, shame about what people think of Christians, and you go, I don't know if I want to associate that. Or maybe there's a moment where you felt ashamed for your faith and you've just held on to that and let that define you. Or it could be abuse shame or trauma shame. Something happened to you, and what has defined us now has become that which happened to us, and it was our fault in some way. That's what shame does. Shame fundamentally says, I do not deserve to be called a son. I'm unworthy of being called a son. That's our first response to shame. So accept it as truth and live it out. We think it will heal it, but it will not. Only grace can. And so let's look at his grace. The Father, unashamed, does something very, very different as this story continues on in verse 20. So he got up and he went to his father. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, he threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. The son said to him, here comes the speech, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father told his servants, quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it. Let's celebrate with a feast, because the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. Only grace can heal shame. And here's what's beautiful about grace. Grace takes on shame to heal shame. Grace takes on shame to heal shame. Now, I want us to see this in this father. The father is obviously looking every day, like any good father, for his son to come back. While he was a long way off, he says, I see him. And what does the father do? The father, because he's moved by compassion, he takes off and he runs to the son. Now, we all maybe like to jog or run, and running is a very normal thing. In that culture, a man of this stature, he never ran anywhere. That was not a thing. He has to take his tunic and pull it up and run. It's a shameful thing to do for a man of his stature. But he takes it on the shame and he runs out there. And he runs out there, and as the son is coming into the gate, probably expecting to hear all the snickers and all the comments from the people at the gate. Oh, look at him back now, coming back. He runs to him and he kisses him. Yes, I'm sure a kiss of affection, but that kiss also in that time meant anything you say to the son, you now say to the father. Again, taking on the foolishness, taking on the shame that is due to the son that came to the father. And I love it that the son, he tries to get the speech out. Remember his 3 points? I've sinned against heaven and you. I am unworthy to be called your son. And the third thing is, here's my solution. I'll become a servant. The father does not let him get the solution out. Because grace knows that we can't actually come up with our own solution. It has to be done by the Father. It's a statement of identity. He says, my son is home. He says, give him the best robe. Well, who has the best robe? It's the Father's robe. You're going to put that beautiful robe on this dirty man who's been with the pigs? He says, give him the ring. The ring is a signet ring, which means that as he wears the ring, anything he says is like the Father saying it. Again, just saying, he's a son. He says, put sandals on his feet. Why? Because sons, they wear shoes. Servants don't, but sons do. I want you to wear clothes befitting of a son. He says, kill the fatted calf, the one we've been fattening up for the big party. We're having a party to celebrate that my son is here. This is incredibly countercultural then and now. What do we expect the Father to be like? Sitting back, stoic. Look who's come back. After he told me I was as good as dead to him. But no, not this Father. I want us to notice 2 things about grace. First, grace initiates. Now, it's true. When I went to the judge, I was waiting for his response. I didn't know. I thought I would get the worst. I was waiting for his response, and thankfully I received his grace. But that's sometimes how we only think of grace. We bring before God, and we hope God's having a good day like that judge was, and he'll show us grace. But look at this. Grace initiates. Grace goes out to him. Grace moves out there, and then grace takes on shame to heal shame. It's the only way for shame to be healed. Now, Jesus is the one telling the story, and we obviously know that Jesus would come fully God and fully man. And what would he do? He would say, I am going to, though I am perfect, Jesus was, I'm going to, as the Bible says, become sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God. He is going to take on our sin. He is going to not only take on our sin, but our shame, and become sin and shame on our behalf by dying on the cross, the death that we deserved. What God should say to us is, yes, you have sinned, and now because of that, you are no longer worthy to be a son. But that's not what God says to us. Because Christ came and he died in our place, because he took on our shame, we now are called, if we believe in him, children of God. And that doesn't change based upon what we do. We have an established identity that is not one of shame, but rather one of grace. Now, I mentioned that the first response to shame oftentimes is to take it on. Take it on as our identity, take it on as our truth, and let that just be what happens, and we spiral down. But there's another response to shame, and it's one that we don't typically think of. And this one is we try to overcome it. And this, we get introduced into the elder brother, the other brother in this situation. Luke 15, verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, right, doing the right thing. As he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. And so he summoned one of the servants, questioning what these things meant. They said, "Your brother is here," he told him, "and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." Then he became angry, and he didn't want to go into the party. And so his father came out and pleaded with him. But he replied to his father, "Look, I've been slaving many years for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me a goat that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him?" Now, this highlights another response to shame, and it may be more of us in this room. This is the one where we say we're going to try and overcome it. This is the overachiever, the one who overcompensates for shame, the one who says, "You know what, I'm going to be successful no matter what. I'm going to overwork. I'm going to overachieve. I'm going to protect myself with this face to make sure I do all the right things so that nobody ever comes up and says, 'You're unworthy.'" It's a covering. It's a hiding. Perfection becomes the goal. We know it's not possible, so what do? We hide. I'll overperform and I'll overfunction, get that second degree and get that promotion, do the thing. Why? Because my hope is that nobody will ever come up and say, "You're unworthy." How could you say I'm unworthy? Look at all these things I have. Look at all these externals. This is the high-functioning kind of shame. He's not slopping with the pigs, but it's still the same thing. We see that because of his response to the father. He says, "You never even once gave me a party. I've been doing everything right." What we learn is that he wasn't doing everything right because he loved the father. He was doing everything right because he was trying to earn this status, to try to cover up something that he says, I don't know if I'm really loved by the father because I got to do all these things to make sure I am. He was trying to prove his worth. And we know this, but no amount of externals, no amount of degrees, no amount of awards, no amount of perfectionism can heal shame. We think it will, but it's never enough. The only healer for shame is grace. Just like it was for the prodigal, it is for this elder son who's done all the right things. Now, I go back to what we said about grace. What does grace do? Grace initiates, and grace takes on shame to heal shame. Look who initiates again. Look back at verse 28. Then the son became angry, and he didn't want to go into the party. And so his father came out, leaves the party, and pleads with him. Now, I want us to notice something again, culturally at this time. When the father is throwing a party, the elder son has a role at that party. The elder son is to be the host. And so the elder son is supposed to be greeting everybody at the party and making sure everyone has everything they need. And the elder son, no son is ever supposed to publicly disagree with the father. But in this moment, everybody notices who's not at this party. Because here we have a party, and guess what? The elder son, who's supposed to be the host, is not there. What does that do? It heaps shame again on the father. What does the father do? He initiates, he goes out, he goes and finds him. He heaps the shame again on the father and says, "I'm going to seek him out." And this is what he says, verse 31. He says, "Son," he said to him, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found." We may have heard this story before, but we need to hear this grace. All the ways we've tried to achieve and perform and be perfect to try to cover shame, the father says, "You've always been mine. You didn't have to earn it. I gave it to you. You're my son who I love, and everything I have is yours." When I say I feel like I'm barely peeling the onion back on grace, it's this kind of story. With that recognition that grace initiates, The grace takes on shame to heal shame. Shame tells you a lie that you must prove to everyone, including God, that you have worth. But God's grace comes and says, you are my child. Not because of something you did. Not because you wallowed in it or because you performed, because of my great grace and mercy, that I would choose to send my son Jesus to come and to die the death that we deserved, to give us what we could not earn and we cannot do anything to keep. But God gives it to us and says it's yours, an identity as a child of God. So what does it mean to continually be transforming from a life motivated and shaped and formed by shame to a life motivated and shaped and formed by grace? It means that we truly settle into this identity as the children of God, that when we say, I'm going to accept it as my truth and try to beat you to the punch and tell you how bad I am, no. Or the other extreme where I'm trying to do everything I can to try to earn it all and make sure everyone can say, look, I'm worthy because I did it all right. No. Rather, we receive the grace of God. It is a gift. We recognize that he has given it to us. One author, a guy named Darrell Johnson, writing about this story, he said, through a bunch of research and different things, they interviewed a bunch of people in the Middle East, and they said, hey, what do you think of this story in a shame-based culture? And every single person they interviewed said, well, what needs to happen at the end of this story is that the elder son needs to take the father aside and say, you are a disgrace. And needs to beat him with a stick, is what they said in this ancient world. Because he has been such a disgrace, because he took on so much shame. He never should have let the son go. Never. Should have punished him for even asking that question. He never should have left the party to go reach out to the son. They said this, in fact, this guy, Darrell Johnson said, the story should actually be called The Prodigal Father. Because in that time and in this culture, it was so shameful of what he did. He says they should take him out and beat him. And in the name of trying to be worthy, isn't that what the Pharisees and scribes did? To God's embodiment of his love and his grace, the person Jesus, they took him and they mocked him. And they beat him and they said, you're a disgrace, you're shameful. And they killed him on the cross through capital punishment for us. And yet Jesus knew that grace initiates, and grace takes on shame to heal shame. It's the only way to be healed.